Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. I'm so used to coming here in the evenings and saying good evening, but good afternoon. I'm Roderick Flood. I'm Provost of Gresham College, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the college for this Gresham College Symposium. We've had an increasing number of symposia of this kind to supplement our regular lecture programme, and we find it a very good way of discussing topics as important as the one that you're discussing today. This is actually a topic which Gresham is devoting quite a lot of attention to, because the current Gresham Professor of Law, Baroness Ruth Deach, is actually lecturing, as you will see if you look at our programme, devoting her Gresham lectures this year to the topic of regulation in a variety of different contexts, including my own field of higher education. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing what she has to say. From an academic perspective, or my own discipline being economic history, of course regulation has an extremely long history, going back certainly before the time of Sir Thomas Gresham, the founder of Gresham College in 1597. Gresham was himself in some senses a regulator, but of course the Mercer's Company, who are one of our sponsors, also could claim to be, with the other great city livery companies, one of the earliest regulatory bodies. So the City of London certainly has a long history of regulation of its trades and industries, and it is interesting as a historian to experience the changes, the nuances of change in the nature of regulation that have occurred over several centuries. It's particularly interesting, I think, now to see the rise of the regulatory state, as it's sometimes called, and the impact of that it's having on a variety of industries, obviously potentially the media, but certainly higher education over the past 20 or 30 years, where we haven't had a move from a state system to a regulated system. We've had a move essentially from a deregulated system to a regulated system. And I think that that has been, for all those engaged in it, a very interesting and instructive process. I'm not sure that I think one can, from a historical perspective, yet assess the impact of the growth of regulation, whether it has or has not been a good thing, as historians tend to think of the past. But I think I'm hoping to learn from you today. I'll be able to stay, I'm afraid, only for a few minutes to hear Dame Suzi Leather, but I very much hope that the rest of this lecture, the rest of this symposium, will illuminate way beyond this particular audience. Gresham began in 1597 as a college to provide useful knowledge, I think, and the new learning to the City of London. We've been doing that by relatively conventional means for 400 odd years, but the extensive change that's taken place in the past decade or so, as with so many other features of modern life, has been the growth of the internet, the fact that all the Gresham lectures, including these today, will be on the web. Last year we had physical lecture audiences in the City of London, averaging about 150 people at each lecture, 20,000 or so over the year, but 1 million or more downloads of our lectures by people across the world. So our contribution to useful knowledge and the new learning nowadays is worldwide, and therefore I'm sure that this symposium today will also have a worldwide impact by those means. So you've got a very crowded programme, so I'm going to shut up and look forward to listening to Dame Suzi and the rest of the programme. Thank you, Michael.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for this invitation to speak, and it's a great pleasure to speak at such an august and properly working charity. I sometimes think that if it were written today, the New Testament would cast Zacchaeus not as a tax collector, but as a regulator. Certainly the words, "I work in regulation," don't always inspire immediate sympathy in the casual acquaintance. And I imagine that some people, possibly some people here today, consider the phrase "good regulator" an oxymoron. One of the symptoms of this collective attitude is that regulators are rarely portrayed as getting it right, certainly judging by the way that their work is reflected in public debate and in the media. Either we're portrayed as hopelessly weak, note how often scandals about people's wrongdoing very quickly become scandals about regulators, or regulators are seen as having assumed far too much power, as being very overbearing, trying to fix what isn't broke, being over-prescriptive, a symptom of a supposed nanny state. And I think this is all perfectly understandable. Indeed, I think it's right that the work of regulators inspires such interest. After all, regulation confronts us with some of the most profound, small p political questions that there are. Questions such as, where in a democracy does the correct balance lie between freedom and compulsion? Between, on the one hand, our qualified rights as citizens to live autonomous lives, to make our own decisions free from unnecessary involvement from the state or its agencies, and on the other hand, our legitimate expectation of protection against the mistakes and misdeeds of others. So in some ways, it's a bit of a them and us dilemma. We, all of us, I think, balk at being controlled by others, at being told what we may or may not do. But this powerful instinct exists alongside the contradictory expectation that other people's behaviour most certainly should be subject to control. And regulators get caught in the middle of this contradiction. So their work, I think, is bound now and again to be the subject of vigorous debate and indeed considerable political differences of opinion. But that doesn't mean that the regulator is doing a bad job. Now, there isn't time, I think, today to debate the question, why regulate? In any case, the precise answer, I think, to that question does depend on who or what is to be regulated. But we surely can't judge what makes a regulator good without having first established whether its purposes are justified, are good. And my argument today is that good regulators, regardless of the sector they work in or the powers at their disposal, should share one core principle in common. And that is that they work for the benefit of the public in the first instance. They exist to serve the public interest. So, not primarily the interests of those being regulated, or indeed the interests of commerce, government, or political parties. How that public interest is defined depends on the regulator in question. At the Charity Commission, a regulator for some 150 years, our focus is on developing public trust and confidence in charities. So ultimately, our goal is to help develop a charitable sector in which the public can have justified confidence and therefore with confidence can give time and money. Now, regulation in the public interest doesn't imply that those being regulated, I think, are particularly likely to work counter to the public interest or indeed are potentially untrustworthy. In fact, quite often, I think the reverse is the case. Regulation is often introduced where the subject is considered to perform an important task and indeed to command at least adequate and sometimes high levels of trust. And public focus regulation generally, I think, has three main aims. Firstly, to help members of the public, either as consumers, as parents, as patients, whatever, to make reasonably well-informed decisions in critical areas of their lives. So making information available to them to help make them, enable them to make those well-informed decisions is a crucial part, I think, of modern regulation. Secondly, public serving regulation works to improve quality. It helps ensure that those being regulated are equipped, empowered, and required to do the best job possible. One often hears the argument that if someone needs a set of regulations to do their best, they shouldn't be doing the job in the first place. And it's a common argument, I think, against independent regulation. But there's a very sound counter-argument to that. And it's that regulation empowers people or groups to resist pressure, often, for instance, from their employer, to work in a way which isn't safe or isn't ethical. So, for instance, airline pilots aren't allowed to fly more than a certain number of hours a year. It's a condition of their registration, and that means that pilots can't be lent on to work longer hours than is safe. And regulation in this case allows a pilot, an individual man or woman, to refuse to perform unethical or unsafe actions by reference to a higher authority. So regulation, far from questioning their subjects' commitment to quality, in fact supports them to maintain standards, to do what they know is right. Regulation helps them cover their back, as it were. Thirdly, public serving regulation helps protect the good name of those being regulated. It helps to prevent fraud and abuse. For example, all charities above a very low income threshold are required to register with the Charity Commission and thereby to have details of their organisation entered onto the public online register. Regulation in this case means that anyone who's thinking of giving money to a charity can very quickly check whether that organisation in question is indeed a charity, because sometimes people do masquerade as charities when they're not. So that means that people who are thinking of fraudulently raising money via a sham charity are deterred from doing so. But I should stress that regulators are not usually prosecuting authorities, so of course they don't actually deal with the crime when it occurs. That is the proper job of the police. But good public-focused regulation, I think, helps reduce the likelihood of crimes or misconduct happening in the first place. So those, in summary, are the three core purposes of public serving regulation: informing choice, improving standards, and deterring abuse. And I hope I've shown professional, commercial, sectoral interests often coincide with the interests of the public. So I think regulation doesn't necessarily imply a kind of clash between the public and those being regulated. But being public-focused as a regulator does mean that when push comes to shove, when conflicts do arise, as they sometimes do, the public interest overrides other interests. I'd now like to look in a little more detail at what this principle of public service looks like in practice. And there are many factors. I can't go through them all, but I do want to highlight 4 factors that I think are indispensable, non-negotiable preconditions for good regulation. And they are these: independence, authority, initiative, and accountability. First, independence. It follows pretty clearly and logically from the core principle of public service. Independence in a regulator means that that regulator is free from undue influence from the sector being regulated, free from political interference by the government of the day or political parties, and free from any interests other than the public interest. And that includes the prejudices, preconceptions, and biases that all human beings have, but which those involved in regulation, at least when they have their regulation hat on, at work must try to rise above. The way in which a regulator demonstrates independence will depend, I think, on the context in which it works. So, for example, at the Charity Commission, we are a non-ministerial government department. All our staff are civil servants. But we are formally and statutorily independent of any government of the day. And our position places, I think, particular responsibility on us to maintain independence from government that the law demands. Other regulators have different independence priorities. Post-Shipman, for instance, it's become important, I think, for regulators to demonstrate that they're independent from the professions that they regulate. Those regulating groups of private businesses similarly work hard to demonstrate independence and impartiality with respect to any commercial pressures or influences. But independence does not equal splendid isolation. Being independent doesn't mean that we can't develop effective relationships and partnerships with those we regulate where that is in the public interest. And at the Commission, for instance, we're placing ever greater emphasis on collaborative working with the charitable sector. Following a strategic review in the light of our very major cut in this spending round, we've concluded that to serve the public effectively, we need to help charity trustees to run their charities more independently, and we're going to try to help them become more self-reliant. So over coming months and years, we're going to be working with charity umbrella bodies to help develop their own capacity to provide tailored advice to charities. We're also going to be encouraging charity trustees to help to try to trust their own judgment more confidently, not least by ensuring that all our online guidance is very easy to understand and to find. And that is because ultimately it's trustees who are responsible for charities. It's not the Charity Commission as a regulator. Now, working collaboratively doesn't mean that we're sacrificing independence. It just means that we're fostering greater autonomy, and it also means that I think we're going to be working much smarter in the way that we use public money. The next factor I want to talk about is authority. A regulator needs to be trusted both by the public and respected by the sector it regulates. Without that authority, the authority that flows precisely from this trust and respect, I think regulators risk doing more harm than good. Now, authority is, of course, a rather complex thing. It's made up of a range of different factors. Let me mention a few that I think are important. First of all, powers. A good regulator needs legal powers that match the task it's been set. It needs access to sufficient funding so it can actually apply those powers. And as important as having powers is being wise about their use. I apologise in advance for a bit of regulatory jargon, but I do think that a sound, appropriate risk framework that's understood not only by the people applying it, but also by the sector being regulated is really important. And ideally, that risk framework should be developed in collaboration with those being regulated. And it should emphasise, I think, that heavy-handed intervention, including the use of statutory powers, should not occur very often, should only occur really rather rarely when the risks are highest. Now, powers, of course, aren't restricted to heavy sanctions. It's amazing what can be achieved with relatively few tools. Here's an example from our work. The Charity Commission has no inspectorate. We don't issue licences. Charity registration is a matter of legal status. It's not a privilege that can be withdrawn. And the Commission cannot impose any financial sanctions. But we have tried to put the tools that we do have available to us to best use, for instance, by using the online register of charities that I've mentioned earlier. That we can use as a key regulatory tool. As I've said, any charity above a certain size has to provide an entry on that register. And that entry shows whether the charity filed its most recent accounts documents on time. There's a prominent green box for charities that did file on time, and a big fat red box for charities whose documents are overdue. So charities that have now filed but missed the deadline are left with a red mark against their relevant page, and this shows for the last 5 years whether those accounts were in on time or not. And this very, very simple visual tool, which requires no additional work on our part, has changed behaviour. And charities have become more diligent in meeting their legal duties to file on time. And charity supporters who use the online register can help make better informed decisions. And I'm frequently told by grant-making charities that their organisations wouldn't dream of supporting a charity that can't be bothered to get its accounts filed with the Commission on time. Now, this, I think, is an example of what's known as reputational regulation, using disclosure and transparency to help encourage good practice and to help the public make decisions. But authority also implies expertise. A good regulator needs access to the right skills mix, to the necessary knowledge and the right disciplines, and of course these vary. At the Food Standards Agency, one of the regulators I have worked with, the relevant disciplines were largely science-based, so nutritional, biological sciences, and so on. At the Charity Commission, we need expertise in charity law, forensic accounting, and investigation techniques. And without this kind of relevant expertise, there would be very little chance of evidence-based authoritative regulation. That expertise doesn't have to lie in the heads of paid members of staff. Some regulators I know make very good use of committees of experts that help supplement their areas of knowledge. So I think it's not so much important exactly where the expertise sits, but that the regulator makes the right use of it. And expertise in a regulator goes beyond just technical knowledge. So to be socially authoritative and to earn public trust, regulators also need, I think, to reflect the society they operate in. They need to demonstrate an understanding of and a commitment to diversity. And some of that is attitudinal diversity. I think you would find it difficult to regulate the use of human embryos in research, as I and indeed Ruth Deach have both done for some periods of time, unless you understand that for some people, the fertilized human egg is not just a ball of cells, it's something quite different. So you can't regulate charities, no matter how great a legal eagle you are, without understanding also that you're dealing, in our case, with trustees, with normal human beings, with a range of reading ages and professional and educational backgrounds. And to be socially authoritative, I think regulators therefore need to, as I've said, understand and reflect on the society in which they operate. So whatever the dimension, ethnicity, gender, religious identity, and so on, I think wise regulators try to signal that they take account of relevant differences. And where the areas regulated involve moral sensitivities, such as the one I've just talked about, social values or very novel developments, I think this becomes even more important. It's crucial then, I think, that an authoritative regulator adopts inclusive, open processes for establishing policy positions, for instance. The Charity Commission took enormous care, for instance, in drafting guidance on what advancing religion means in charity law. This was a task that fell to us following the passing of the 2006 Charity Act. What is a religion? What are the characteristics that religions defined as such in law must share, bearing in mind that some beliefs involve the worship of a god, some the worship of more than one god, and some no god at all. Communication skills, particularly when you're talking about areas such as this, are also really important. You can't work on behalf of the public unless the public understands what you do and gets it. Authority, to me, finally, also implies an appetite to learn and a willingness to change. I think it's the same principle that applies to us as individual human beings. People with real authority tend to be confident about conceding when they're not perfect They should be happy to defer to other people when they don't know the answer themselves, and they should be happy to admit when they've made a mistake. Regulators should, of course, strive to know all the relevant answers and should try not to make mistakes, but I think it's really important when you're in the position of a regulator that you are open to challenge and you're confident enough to accept criticism. So it's important, I think, to welcome opportunities and to structure opportunities into the way your organisation works to help you learn and improve. Sometimes these opportunities to learn and improve are structured in different ways. In 2008, the new Charity Tribunal came into operation, and its role is to offer an independent route for appeal for charities that have exhausted our own decision review processes. And we could have been, I think, rather defensive about the tribunal. We could have seen it as a threat or a danger, and certainly its work has at times certainly been high profile, and it's absolutely not always been comfortable for us. But I've welcomed it, and I think that as an organisation we've benefited hugely from its work, and it's certainly helped to clarify areas of the law relevant to our work that were previously unclear. And recently, very recently, the week before last, it helped clarify the law on public benefit and fee-paying independent schools following a long-running legal debate in the sector. And that clarification will help us do a better job on behalf of the public. So to maintain authority, I think regulators have to listen to those they work with, in our case charities, and the public primarily. And I think the experience of listening to criticism from your own customers is actually hugely valuable. One of the things I emphasised when I came to the Commission 5 years ago was that as an organisation we needed to be more permeable, to be prepared to listen more and to be prepared to work more with others. And we've certainly brought about huge changes in the last few years to our processes, making them easier and simpler and faster. But all of that started with listening. I'd like to focus briefly now on initiative and innovation, why I think they are very important in the context of regulation. To my mind, it's vital that good regulators anticipate risk and try to prevent problems. And a significant part of every regulator's role is, of course, to step in and take action when things go seriously awry. But unless that kind of work is balanced by a considerable emphasis on preventive guidance, all that a regulator is going to achieve is the occasional headline in the press. And it's unlikely, I think, really to raise standards within the sector it regulates, and I think ultimately, therefore, it will have failed the public. And this emphasis on prevention stems in part from my basic sense of why people do wrong when they do. And for me, the words of the General Confession hits the mark. We do wrong through negligence, weakness, and our own deliberate fault. Those may sound like familiar words to some of you. And it's in that order: negligence, then weakness, and only lastly, deliberate wrongdoing. And a good regulator, therefore, I think, should be very clear about what good looks like and should provide clear, targeted guidance to help prevent unknowing wrongdoing, as well, of course, as being alive to the possibility of deliberate malice. A preventive approach also, I think, helps resolve dilemmas and paradoxes that often accompany the work of regulators. For instance, we, like other regulators, I'm sure, have a key objective to promote and increase public trust in the area we regulate. And to do so, part of our role is therefore to investigate abuse and misconduct and to publicise such cases to help other charities avoid the similar problems. But of course, those two don't sit very happily together. And our own research demonstrates that one of the factors most likely to drive down trust in charities generally is having read or heard about problems occurring in a charity. So in fulfilling a core duty, we actually risk undermining the ultimate purpose. And these paradoxes are rather frustrating. But I think that we can help overcome them by working to try to avoid serious problems arising in the first place. And preventing problems requires a range of skills and actions. And I do think that regulators need to be really good horizon scanners. They need to be able to anticipate systemic risks facing those being regulated. They need to be intelligently aware of the wider environment in which those being regulated are working. And this links back to what I said about the importance of having expertise and authority. And crucially, preventing problems also requires investment, as I've said, in excellent guidance. Now, in my view, that guidance should, wherever possible, be principle rather than rules-based. I think the difference between the two isn't always clear, and it can be exaggerated. But my view is that regulatory guidance that's largely principle-based is marked by certain characteristics. It certainly differentiates between legal requirements and general recommendations. It therefore sets out very clearly when something must be done or should be done. And it's clear when a decision is for those being regulated to make. So, for instance, our guidance doesn't dictate how much a charity should spend on fundraising. It doesn't dictate how much it may pay its chief executive, both of which we know are very important issues, actually, for the general public. But we point out that trustees have a responsibility to protect their charities' reputations, and it's for them to think through what the pay packet for the CEO means. So it's certainly not for the Commission, I think. Principle-based guidance is also aspirational, and it promotes trust. It expects and assumes that people reading that guidance want to do what's right, to go back to my analysis of when people do wrong. And finally, a regulator with initiative is also one, I think, that's clear about what it as an organisation cannot do, where its own role ends, or indeed never even began. Because, as I mentioned at the beginning, regulators that don't explain the limits of their role risk being portrayed as weak when problems arise, when they actually aren't in their remit to solve. And such situations can be, well, at best embarrassing, sometimes quite painful, as many regulators here probably recognise. We're often contacted in this respect by people who are very, very upset, for instance, about a dispute that's happening in a charity that they feel very strongly about, want us to be involved, and they want us to stride in and do something. There are, in fact, very few cases of disputes in charities that we think do require our involvement, and as a general rule, we don't get involved in disputes between trustees. We, of course, investigate serious governance failures, but a simple case of deadlock between trustees and those kinds of disagreements does not, I think, merit the attention of the regulator. Computer says no is not an easy message to communicate. People are very disappointed when we don't take up what they want us to. They write to their MPs, they write to members of the House of Lords, there are newspaper articles, there are public statements about, the weakness of the regulator not taking up the cause of this or that. But I think that good regulation does require that you are very clear about what is and what isn't for you, and are then consistent about making that happen. Lastly, accountability. In a democracy, I think it's vital that regulators are answerable to the public they claim to serve, particularly where that regulation is funded from the public purse, or where it's legally independent and not therefore subject to the ultimate accounting mechanism of the ballot box. And like authority, accountability is complex. It's demonstrated in different ways depending on the context of that regulation. But there are, I think, some core points that probably do apply to all regulators, indeed all public institutions. The first is simply to note that accountability is an attitude as much as an action. It's about a commitment to integrity, a constant awareness and alertness to the fact that you are acting on behalf of the public. It's about adopting a default position of maximum openness and candour. Most regulators are of course, restricted as to how much they can say about certain areas of their work, Most work with personal data. They're required to handle that very carefully. And the Commission has to be very careful about what we say publicly about ongoing investigations. But generally speaking, our attitude is and should be, what are we able to say, not what we can get away with not saying. And we ask what's in the public interest to disclose, not what could embarrass us as a regulator. My second point on accountability relates to performance and performance measurement. Because you can't really go about saying that you serve the public interest unless you show that you're actually making a difference. So you do need goals, and those goals should be set in collaboration with others. Our current key performance indicators, which we're revising, were agreed with the Treasury. But it's not enough to set targets. I do think you have to report on their progress as well. We, like many other regulators, appear before the Public Administration Select Committee. That's not a formality. The experience is quite bracing, as they say, and we had our hearing the day before yesterday. But these hearings are, I think, a very important opportunity for us to be held to account for the money we're given. And in a time of reduced public spending, that need for responsibility for the money we're given is even greater. So it's a good and important chance to answer to the public we serve. We, of course, also hold our own public meetings open to anyone, and we put a lot of effort into those public meetings because they are a really important opportunity for people to ask us directly fundamental questions about the way we operate. Holding public meetings like this is not always comfortable. It can be quite risky. It's not a discipline that many private organisations are used to, but it is important, and I think that scrutiny, if it applied perhaps more widely, would probably raise performance in other areas of the economy as well. So to conclude, I'm very conscious that I've only just scratched the surface of what it means to be a good regulator. What I was trying to do really was not to provide a list of all the different building blocks, but to say, well, what are the foundations on which this construction work happens? So to summarise, a good regulator, to me, is one that serves the public interest in everything it does. It demonstrates independence in approaching its work, authority and initiative in the content of its work, and accountability about the impact of its work. And I think all the other important foundations that we'll probably be talking about this afternoon can probably be placed on those 4 stones. Thank you.